I am Douglas, 67 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent a lifetime building foundations meant to last. I always believed I had built a strong one for my son Brian. I was walking up to his apartment with the finalized legal paperwork to transfer $900,000 so he and his wife Natalie could finally purchase their dream home. But when I approached their open patio door, I overheard a conversation that completely shattered the reality I thought I lived in. Instead of handing over my life savings, I spent the next week orchestrating a financial demolition they never saw coming. Before I continue my story, let me know which city or state you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut ties with toxic family members who tried to take advantage of your generosity. Now let me tell you exactly how it happened. The drive over to their ground floor apartment was supposed to be the culmination of my life's work. The heavy leather folder resting on the passenger seat of my truck contained the final trust documents. Inside those thick, formal pages was a cashier's check and a legally binding transfer of $900,000. It was the exact amount they needed to buy the sprawling suburban house Natalie had been obsessing over for 6 months. I remember the crisp autumn air flowing through my cracked window as I navigated the familiar streets. My hands felt steady on the steering wheel. I felt a profound, quiet pride swelling in my chest. Since my wife passed away 12 years ago, my entire existence had been narrowed down to one singular purpose: ensuring our only son would never have to struggle the way we did when we were young. I had worked 80-hour weeks managing commercial construction sites, breathing in concrete dust and reviewing blueprints until my eyes blurred all to build a safety net that could withstand anything. Handing over this money was not a loss for me. It was a victory. It was the ultimate proof that I had been a good father. I pulled into the visitor parking space of their complex, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, just resting my hand on the leather folder. I imagined the look on Brian's face when he realized he would own his home entirely debt-free. I imagined the relief in his eyes. I gathered the folder, stepped out of the truck, and walked down the paved pathway toward their patio. The afternoon was unseasonably warm, and the sliding glass door leading to their living room was cracked open by a few inches to let in the breeze. I raised my hand to knock on the glass, but the sound of Natalie's voice stopped me cold. She was not speaking to Brian. She was on the phone, and her tone was entirely devoid of the sweet, high-pitched warmth she always used when speaking to me. Her voice was sharp, fast, and aggressively calculating. She was talking to her older brother. I stood absolutely still, my knuckles inches from the glass, as her words drifted through the opening. She told her brother that the old man was finally bringing the money today. But that was not the part that froze the blood in my veins. It was what she said next. She instructed her brother to have the legal paperwork ready for the new limited liability company they had secretly formed. She said very clearly that the second my funds cleared the bank, the deed to the new house would be registered exclusively under her family's LLC. She laughed a cold, metallic sound and assured her brother that Brian was completely clueless about real estate law and would not get a single dime of equity in the property. My $900,000 was not going to my son. It was going to be entirely absorbed by her family. I felt a sickening drop in my stomach, like a support beam giving way under massive pressure. But the structural failure of my family was not finished. Natalie lowered her voice slightly, leaning against the kitchen counter, just visible through the blinds. She told her brother that they had already finalized the arrangement for my living situation. She said Brian had finally caved and agreed to the plan. Once the house was secured, they were going to legally force me into a state-run low-income care facility out by the county highway. She casually mentioned that they would just tell the doctors I was suffering from severe memory issues and early dementia. She said I was becoming a nuisance, constantly lingering around, and it was time to put me away, where I could not interfere with their new lifestyle. I stopped breathing. The leather folder in my hand suddenly felt like a block of lead. I waited desperately, hoping I had misunderstood, hoping there was some context I was missing. But then I heard the heavy footsteps of my son entering the kitchen. I prayed for Brian to speak up. I prayed to hear the boy I raised defend his father, to tell his wife that stealing my money and locking me away was an absolute betrayal. Natalie did not hang up the phone. She simply looked at Brian and told him she was finalizing the LLC details with her brother, and reminded him that they needed to tour the nursing facility next week to sign the intake forms. I stood outside the window, my heart pounding a slow, agonizing rhythm against my ribs. Brian sighed. It was not a sigh of resistance. It was a sigh of mild inconvenience. He told his wife that it was just so exhausting dealing with me lately. He said I always wanted to talk about the past, and that my constant presence was suffocating their marriage. He looked right at her and said we have to secure our future, even if it means making tough decisions about him. He agreed. He validated every single word. He was not a victim of her manipulation. He was a willing participant in my destruction. In that fraction of a second, the father-son bond completely snapped. The boy who used to sit on my shoulders at construction sites. The young man whose college tuition I had drained my savings to pay the son I had loved more than my own life ceased to exist. He was replaced by a stranger standing in a kitchen, casually discussing the theft of my life's work and the erasure of my freedom. I did not bang on the glass. I did not storm into the apartment and demand an explanation. Decades of engineering had taught me that when a structure is critically compromised, you do not hit it with a hammer. You step back, assess the load-bearing failures, and prepare for a controlled demolition. I slowly lowered my hand. I stepped backward, making sure my shoes did not crunch on the gravel. I turned around and walked back down the pathway to my truck. Every step felt like I was moving through deep water, but my mind was rapidly clearing, replacing shock with a cold, absolute focus. I climbed into the driver's seat and locked the doors. I opened the heavy leather folder, took out the cashier's check for $900,000 and tore it neatly down the middle. I tore it again and again until it was nothing but useless confetti. Then I took the trust documents, the beautiful legal promises of a father's love, and ripped them to shreds. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. I did not go home. I drove directly to my primary bank branch downtown. If they were planning to declare me legally incompetent to steal my assets, I needed to reinforce my financial perimeter immediately. I walked into the bank, bypassed the teller line, and requested an immediate emergency meeting with the branch manager whom I had known for 15 years. I instructed him to freeze all of my accounts, revoke all outgoing wire privileges, and place a mandatory in-person verification lock on every single dollar I owned. As the manager was typing the overrides into the system, his hands suddenly stopped. He looked up at me, his face pale. He turned his monitor to show me the screen. Less than an hour ago, while I was driving to their apartment, an electronic request had been submitted to wire $300,000 from my secondary savings account directly into an unknown corporate account. The authorization document attached to the request was a temporary medical power of attorney. It was a document I had signed 3 years ago when I was put under general anesthesia for a knee replacement, granting Brian temporary authority, just in case something went wrong during surgery. He had kept it. He was trying to drain my accounts before I even arrived with the check. They were not just waiting to betray me. They were actively executing the theft. The first chain of the conflict was now locked into place, and the silent adjustment had begun. The heavy oak door of Aaron Fletcher's downtown office clicked shut, sealing out the noise of the city traffic. I sat in the high-backed leather chair across from his desk, resting my hands flat on the polished wood surface. The office smelled of old paper and bitter coffee. Aaron was a man who understood the architecture of wealth. He had been my estate attorney for 2 decades, drafting the very documents I had just torn to shreds. He sat back, his pen hovering over a yellow legal pad, waiting for me to explain why I had demanded an emergency meeting at 4 in the afternoon. I did not offer a warm greeting. I did not make small talk about his recent golf trip. I just looked at him, feeling the final traces of the soft, accommodating father evaporate into the air. In its place, the cold, calculating mind of a structural engineer took over. For 40 years, I made my living analyzing the integrity of steel and concrete. I was paid to find the invisible stress fractures in load-bearing columns before they brought an entire skyscraper down. You cannot negotiate with physics. You cannot guilt a cracking foundation into holding strong. When a structure is compromised, sentimentality will get people killed. You have to look at the numbers, isolate the failure, and act with absolute precision. Sitting in that chair, I realized my family was no longer a home. It was a condemned building. Brian and Natalie were not my children anymore. They were a catastrophic structural failure, and I was the only one holding the blueprints. Aaron noticed the shift in my posture. He put his pen down and leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. He asked me what had happened to the trust transfer. I told him there would be no transfer. My voice was completely flat, stripped of any paternal grief. I laid out the facts as if I were reading a site inspection report. I explained the phone call I had overheard through the patio window. I detailed Natalie's plan to funnel the $900,000 into a newly formed, limited liability company controlled by her brother. I recounted Brian's casual agreement to falsely declare me medically incompetent and lock me in a state-run facility. I did not shed a single tear as I spoke the words. Tears are for things that can be fixed. This could only be demolished. Aaron's professional composure cracked for a fraction of a second. His eyes widened, and he let out a slow, heavy breath. He had known Brian since he was a teenager. He started to offer his condolences. I stopped him mid-sentence. I told him I did not come here for sympathy. I came here for a tactical assessment. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the printed alert the bank manager had given me an hour earlier. I slid the single sheet of paper across the desk. Aaron picked it up and read it. The color drained from his face as he processed the information. I explained that while I was standing on their patio, listening to them plot my medical imprisonment, Brian had attempted to execute a wire transfer of $300,000 from my secondary savings account. He had used a 3-year-old temporary medical power of attorney from my knee replacement surgery to bypass the standard security protocols. Aaron stared at the paper, his legal mind rapidly calculating the severity of the crime. He said, attempting to utilize an outdated power of attorney for personal financial gain was textbook elder fraud. He said it was a felony, and we could involve the authorities immediately. I shook my head. I told him that calling the police right now would just result in a messy emotional dispute. Natalie would play the victim, Brian would claim it was a misunderstanding, and they would scatter like roaches when the lights turn on. I did not want them to scatter. I wanted them to step fully into the trap. If you want to demolish a building safely, you do not just throw dynamite at the walls. You plant the charges at the exact points of maximum vulnerability, and you wait for gravity to do the rest. I leaned closer to Aaron and gave him my instructions. I told him I needed a complete stealth audit of every single financial perimeter I had built. I wanted every joint account, every credit line, and every tax document reviewed and verified. If Brian and Natalie had the audacity to execute a fraudulent wire transfer today, they had likely been testing the structural integrity of my assets for months. I needed to know exactly how deep the rot went before I pulled the trigger. Aaron nodded slowly, picking up his pen again. He asked me what we were going to do about the $900,000 they were expecting for the house. I looked at him with a perfectly calm expression. I told him we were going to give them exactly what they asked for, but we were going to hand it to them inside a financial Trojan horse that would burn their entire world to the ground. Aaron began to write. The blueprint for their destruction was officially in motion. Aaron turned toward his dual monitors and began typing with practiced speed. The mechanical clicking of his keyboard filled the quiet room as he accessed the master ledger of my estate. We were not just looking at numbers on a screen. We were looking at the entire architecture of my adult life mapped out in columns and rows. He opened the primary commercial trust file first. It was the largest account holding the bulk of the wealth I had accumulated over 4 decades. Staring at that massive figure, I did not feel a sense of pride. I felt the phantom ache in my lower back and the exhausting weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. When my wife passed away 12 years ago, my world completely collapsed. Some men turn to the bottle to drown their grief, while others simply give up. I turned to concrete and steel. I threw myself into the most demanding high-risk structural engineering contracts on the East Coast. I oversaw the construction of massive suspension bridges and 70-story commercial towers in the city center. I worked through freezing winter rain and blistering summer heat, breathing in silica dust and sleeping in temporary site trailers just to stay close to the project. I missed holidays. I skipped vacations. Every single dollar in that primary trust was earned through physical sacrifice, brutal negotiations, and unforgiving deadlines. I built an impenetrable financial fortress because I believed the world was a dangerous, unpredictable place, and I wanted to ensure my son would never face the kind of poverty that keeps you awake at night. Aaron clicked out of the primary trust and opened the historical transfer logs. The screen instantly filled with years of outgoing transactions, each one a glaring testament to my fatal flaw as a parent. Line by line, the digital audit revealed the stark, undeniable contrast between how I built my life and how Brian chose to live his. I believed in digging deep and pouring a strong foundation before erecting a single wall. Brian believed in skipping the hard work and moving straight into the penthouse. The banking records showed the $50,000 I wired him when he was 25 to fund a tech startup that folded completely within 6 months. Below that was the massive $80,000 bridge loan I provided when he tried to flip a dilapidated residential property without hiring a proper inspector. He had ignored the rotting floor joists to save a few bucks. The project went instantly bankrupt, and I quietly covered his severe losses to save his credit score from total ruin. He always had grand visions of wealth, but he possessed absolutely zero discipline to execute them. As Aaron scrolled through the endless list of bailouts and finalized debt settlements, a sickening realization washed over me. The evidence was right in front of my eyes. I had not been protecting my son. I had been systematically destroying his ability to survive in the real world. Every time he took a reckless financial shortcut, I was there to pave the road beneath his feet. I taught him that failure had no consequences as long as I was alive to write the check. He never learned the value of $1 because he never had to sweat for one. Watching the cursor move down the screen, I understood exactly why he felt no remorse about the conversation I had overheard on the patio. In Brian's mind, my money did not belong to me. It was simply a resource waiting to be harvested. The attempt to use my old medical records to seize my savings was not a sudden act of desperation. It was the ultimate logical escalation of a lifetime of entitlement. He had spent his entire adulthood taking the easy way out, and stealing my estate while locking me in a facility was just the final, most efficient shortcut of them all. Aaron stopped scrolling. The rhythmic clicking of his keyboard ceased abruptly. He leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes narrowing as he focused on a specific subfolder. It was the secondary joint account I had established 5 years ago, designed strictly as an emergency fund for Brian and Natalie in case of unexpected medical bills or severe job loss. I had rarely checked the balance, trusting them to honor the sacred purpose of that safety net. Aaron pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose and let out a low, sharp breath. The audit had just moved past my historical mistakes as a father. We had just hit the live wire of their current deception. Aaron clicked the mouse and the screen transitioned to the secondary joint account. I had set this specific fund up 5 years ago, shortly after Brian and Natalie were married. I deposited $100,000 into it with very clear and very strict instructions. It was a safety net, an emergency reservoir designed to sit completely untouched unless catastrophe struck. I told them it was strictly for catastrophic medical bills, a sudden job loss, or a structural emergency with their living situation. I wanted them to sleep well at night, knowing that if the bottom ever fell out of their lives, they would not hit the concrete. I had not looked at the balance in over 3 years, trusting the quiet respect I assumed they had for my hard work. But as the digital ledger loaded on Aaron's monitor, the number staring back at us was not 100,000 plus interest. The balance at the top of the screen read $38,000. My chest tightened, not from the loss of the money, but from the sudden jarring realization that my perimeter had been breached long before today. Aaron did not speak. He simply began filtering the transaction history, organizing the withdrawals by date and amount. If Brian had lost his job, or if someone had required major surgery, I would have known. There had been no emergencies. There had been no desperate phone calls for help. I leaned closer to the glow of the screen, my eyes scanning the rows of data with the cold precision of a site inspector, looking for the source of a leak. The theft had not happened all at once. It was not a single massive wire transfer that would have triggered a fraud alert. It was a slow, methodical, and deliberate siphoning of funds. It was a calculated bleed designed to go unnoticed by an old man they assumed was too trusting or too foolish to check his own ledgers. The withdrawals started small, just a few $100s here and there, testing the waters to see if I was watching. When I did not call to ask about a $500 charge, the amounts began to escalate. I asked Aaron to isolate the merchant names attached to the routing numbers. The screen refreshed, replacing the vague banking codes with the exact destinations of my stolen money. The evidence of Natalie's hidden life materialized right in front of my eyes. The funds I had bled and sweat to save for their survival had been systematically liquidated to construct a counterfeit image of wealth. There were recurring monthly payments of $900 to a luxury automotive leasing company for the European vehicle she drove. It was the same vehicle she claimed her real estate brokerage had provided as a company car. There were charges in the thousands for boutique designer clothing stores, downtown high-end cosmetic clinics, and weekend spa retreats she took with her friends. I watched the cursor highlight a charge for $4,000 at a custom jewelry design studio dated just 2 weeks before my birthday. She had bought herself a diamond tennis bracelet using my emergency medical fund, and then had the audacity to hand me a cheap store-bought card for my birthday, claiming things were tight financially. The sheer arrogance of it was staggering. She was not stealing out of desperation. She was stealing out of pure, unadulterated vanity. She treated my life savings as her own personal slush fund, swiping the debit card linked to that account with absolute impunity. Brian either knew about it and lacked the spine to stop her, or he was so oblivious to his own household finances that she had managed to hide a massive secondary income from him entirely. Knowing my son, it was likely the latter. He was always too lazy to look at the details. Aaron highlighted the final column and hit a key to run the total sum of the unauthorized withdrawals over the past 36 months. The number flashed at the bottom of the screen in bright red font. $62,000. Natalie had stolen $62,000 from a man she was actively plotting to lock away in a state-run nursing home. The silence in the office was absolute. Aaron took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a rare display of genuine exhaustion. He had spent his entire career untangling the messy and often greedy disputes of wealthy families, but the brazen nature of this theft seemed to leave even him at a loss for words. He looked up at me, likely expecting to see an old man broken by the weight of a daughter-in-law's cruelty. But I was not broken. The grief had completely burned away, leaving nothing but a cold, hard clarity. This discovery changed the entire architecture of my retaliation. Before this moment, my goal had simply been to protect my remaining assets and sever ties with a disrespectful son. But the $62,000 changed the equation entirely. This was no longer just about Brian's passive entitlement or his cowardly agreement to put me in a facility. This was about a predator who had actively infiltrated my family, drained my resources, and was now preparing for the final fatal strike against my freedom. I stared at the red number on the screen until it was burned into my retinas. Every dollar of that $62,000 represented an hour of my life I would never get back. It represented the weekends I spent pouring concrete in the freezing rain instead of being home. She had stolen my time. She had stolen my legacy. I stood up from the leather chair and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the city skyline. I looked out at the buildings, some of which I had helped design, standing tall and immovable against the wind. A good engineer knows that when you find a parasite destroying the wood, you do not just patch the hole. You exterminate the threat, and you make sure the entire colony collapses. I turned back to Aaron. He had his hands folded over the keyboard, waiting for my command. I told him to print out every single page of the transaction history, to highlight every designer shoe, every spa treatment, and every lease payment. I wanted it all bound in a single, undeniable physical document. The $62,000 was no longer just stolen money. It was the exact price of her admission into the trap we were about to build. The financial autopsy was complete. We had found the cause of death of this family. Now it was time to prepare the burial. The heavy silence in Aaron's office was suddenly broken by the sharp vibration of my cell phone against the polished mahogany desk. The caller ID illuminated the screen. It was Natalie. Aaron looked at the phone, then looked at me, a silent question passing between us. Just minutes ago, we had uncovered the undeniable proof that this woman had stolen $62,000 from my emergency medical fund to buy designer clothes and diamond jewelry. Now she was calling the very man she was actively robbing, likely to secure the final $900,000 before locking him in a state-run care facility. I did not hesitate. I reached across the desk, pressed the green button to accept the call, and immediately put her on speakerphone. I held my index finger to my lips, signaling Aaron to remain absolutely silent. When I spoke, my voice carried none of the cold, calculating fury that was currently freezing my veins. Instead, I carefully engineered my tone to sound slightly tired, a little confused, and overwhelmingly eager to please. I played the exact role she had assigned to me in her arrogant mind. I said hello, adding a slight waver to my breath, asking how her afternoon was going. Her response echoed through the quiet office, dripping with an artificial, sugary sweetness that made my stomach churn. She called me Dad, a title she had absolutely no right to use, and asked if I was feeling okay today. She said she and Brian were just so worried about me living all alone in my big, empty house, and that they were hoping to finalize the real estate paperwork so they could finally settle down and have me over for Sunday dinners. It was a masterful performance of manipulation. She spoke with the smooth, practiced cadence of a seasoned predator, completely unaware that the man on the other end of the line was holding a printed ledger of her theft. Then she initiated the pivot. The sweet concern dissolved into a manufactured sense of urgency. She let out a heavy theatrical sigh and told me that their real estate agent had just called with terrible news. According to Natalie, the sellers of the suburban home they wanted had received a sudden all-cash offer from an out-of-state investor. She claimed the sellers were going to back out of their agreement with Brian unless they could produce the $900,000 by the end of the week. She said they needed me to expedite the funds immediately. I looked at Aaron across the desk. He rolled his eyes, silently recognizing the oldest real estate scam in the book. There was no cash buyer. There was only Natalie, desperate to secure my money before her brother finalized the fraudulent limited liability company they had created to steal the house from my son. I kept my voice perfectly steady, injecting just enough panic to make her believe her tactic was working flawlessly. I told her I was so sorry to hear that, and I asked her what we needed to do. Sensing my complete compliance, she pushed the blade a little deeper. She lowered her voice, adopting a tone of sorrowful desperation. She told me that if they lost this house, Brian would be absolutely devastated. She said the housing market in our city was getting too expensive, and if this deal fell through, they would have no choice but to relocate across the country to find something affordable. Then came the ultimate threat, delivered with absolute precision. She said it would just break her heart if they had to move so far away, because it meant I would never get to see my future grandchildren grow up. She was weaponizing my legacy against me. She was threatening me with the ultimate isolation, dangling the promise of family, like a piece of meat in front of a starving dog, all while secretly planning to throw me into a locked medical ward the second my check cleared the bank. I closed my eyes, absorbing the profound depths of her cruelty. A weak man would have broken down. A foolish man would have screamed at her over the phone, demanding his stolen money back. I did neither. I leaned closer to the microphone and delivered the exact words she wanted to hear. I told her not to worry about a single thing. I told her I would never let them lose their dream home, and that I would personally ensure the $900,000 was in their hands by dinner tomorrow evening. I promised her I would take care of everything. The relief in her voice was palpable. She thanked me profusely, called me the greatest father in the world, and promised to bake my favorite pie for our dinner meeting. I told her I was looking forward to it, and I ended the call. The click of the disconnected line echoed loudly in Erin's office. The artificial sweetness of her voice vanished, leaving behind the cold, sterile reality of our war room. Erin let out a long breath and shook his head, his hands resting on the stack of financial evidence we had just compiled. He remarked that she was a terrifyingly good liar. I looked at the dark screen of my phone and corrected him. I told him she was a greedy liar, and greed always creates massive structural blind spots. She was so entirely focused on the massive payout that she was no longer paying attention to the foundation she was standing on. She assumed I was handing her a gift, but a gift has no strings attached. I was not going to give her a gift. I was going to give her a loaded weapon and let her point it squarely at her own chest. I turned my attention back to Erin and gave him his final set of instructions for the day. I told him to completely scrap the standard family trust transfer documents we had previously prepared. I wanted the $900,000 pulled directly from the corporate reserves of my primary commercial engineering firm, Carter Holdings. I instructed him to draft the financial transfer not as a personal family gift, but as a heavily restricted high-interest corporate bridge loan. I wanted the contract buried under layers of dense commercial real estate jargon that Natalie, in her arrogant rush to steal the money, would never bother to read. I told Erin to build specific lethal legal tripwires into the very fabric of the contract. The funds had to be strictly designated for the purchase of a primary residential property under Brian's name only. I mandated a clause stating that if the money was deposited into any unregistered shell company, or if the property title was altered in any way to exclude my son after the funds were released, the contract would automatically trigger an immediate default. More importantly, it would legally classify the transaction as an act of commercial embezzlement. By structuring the transfer this way, we were removing the impending dispute completely out of the realm of a messy family civil court. We were elevating it directly into the unforgiving jurisdiction of federal banking authorities and corporate fraud investigators. She thought she was outsmarting a frail old man who was slowly losing his memory. I was going to ensure she was legally defrauding a multi-million-dollar commercial holding company with a zero-tolerance policy for theft. Erin's eyes widened as the brilliant, devastating brutality of the plan fully clicked into place in his mind. He did not say another word. He simply nodded, pulled a fresh legal pad toward him, and began outlining the corporate documents. The bait was no longer just an easily acquired stack of cash. It was a steel-jawed trap buried under the illusion of a victory. She had asked for the money, and tomorrow evening I was going to hand it to her. The trap was now officially set. I parked my truck a block away from their apartment building. I needed the short walk to properly adjust my physical posture. For the last 40 years, I had walked with the rigid, upright bearing of a man used to commanding active construction sites. Tonight, I needed to strip all of that away. I rolled my shoulders forward, letting my spine curve slightly. I slowed my pace, dragging my left foot just a fraction of an inch against the pavement. I let my expression go slack, softening the hard lines around my jaw. By the time I reached their front door, I was no longer Douglas, the structural engineer who had just engineered their financial ruin. I was exactly who they wanted me to be. I was a frail, tired old man whose mind was slowly slipping away into the fog of early dementia. I knocked on the door with a light, hesitant tap. Natalie swung it open almost instantly. The smell of roasted chicken and baked apple pie drifted out from the kitchen. She was wearing a perfectly ironed floral dress, her face glowing with a manufactured smile that belonged on a television commercial. She reached out and grabbed my arms, pulling me into a tight, dramatic hug. She told me how wonderful it was to see me and how much she had been looking forward to this dinner. I patted her back with trembling hands, playing the part of the grateful father-in-law. I stepped inside and saw Brian standing by the dining table pouring wine into expensive crystal glasses. Those were glasses that I now knew had been purchased with money stolen from my emergency medical fund. Brian looked up and offered a tight, nervous smile. He asked how I was feeling. I did not give him a sharp, articulate answer. Instead, I paused, looking around the room as if I was slightly disoriented. I took off my coat and fumbled with the buttons, letting my fingers shake just enough to be noticeable. I asked him what day it was, claiming I had somehow lost track of the week. The look that passed between Brian and Natalie was instantaneous. It was a look of smug validation. They genuinely believed my mind was failing. They believed their plan to lock me in a state-run facility was not just cruel, but entirely justified by my apparent decline. Natalie gently took my coat, speaking to me in the slow, loud voice people reserve for toddlers or the deeply impaired. She guided me to the head of the table, treating me like a fragile piece of glass that might shatter at any moment. I sat down and let out a long, exaggerated sigh, rubbing my temples. I told them I was just so tired lately, and that keeping up with my own house was becoming far too much for me to handle. Natalie placed a plate of hot food in front of me, her eyes shining with absolute greed. She touched my shoulder and told me not to worry about a single thing. She promised that once they closed on the new house, everything would be easier. She said they would take complete care of me and I would never have to stress about my living situation again. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. She was feeding me a warm meal while mentally measuring me for a straitjacket. I picked up my fork and ate the food, making sure to chew slowly and drop a small piece of potato onto my shirt. Brian watched me do it, and I saw the distinct flash of disgust cross his face. My own son was repulsed by the weakness he thought he was witnessing. He took a large sip of his wine, completely failing to realize that the weakness was a perfectly constructed illusion. Internally, my mind was operating with the cold, razor-sharp precision of a steel trap waiting to spring. I noted the brand of the wine, acknowledging that it cost at least $200 a bottle. I noted the new diamond tennis bracelet glittering on Natalie's wrist, the very bracelet she had bought with my stolen money. I cataloged every piece of evidence, every lie, and every patronizing smile. As the dinner progressed, I continued to feed their arrogance. I talked about how confused banking made me these days. I mentioned how hard it was to read the small print on legal documents. I handed them every single excuse they needed to feel completely secure in their theft. I wanted them to believe I was entirely helpless without them. The more helpless I acted, the more confident they became. Natalie poured me a glass of water, her hand brushing against the thick leather folder I had placed on the empty chair beside me. She asked what was in the folder, her voice trembling with barely contained excitement. I looked at the folder and then looked back at her, putting on a soft, bewildered smile. I told her I brought the paperwork for the house just like she asked. I said I wanted to make sure they got their dream home before my memory got any worse. Brian finally looked me directly in the eyes, his guilt momentarily warring with his greed. The greed won instantly. He told me I was doing the right thing and that this was the best move for our family's future. He had fully convinced himself that stealing my money and my freedom was an act of mercy. The plates were cleared away, and Natalie brought out the apple pie she had promised. She cut a massive slice and placed it carefully in front of me. It was the celebratory dessert for a victory they thought they had already won. The atmosphere in the room was thick with their unspoken triumph. They thought they had successfully manipulated a dying man into handing over the keys to his kingdom. They had no idea that the frail old man sitting at their dining table had already rewritten the deed to their destruction. I took a slow, deliberate bite of the pie. The dinner of deception had served its exact purpose. They were completely relaxed, entirely disarmed, and utterly blind to the steel jaws resting silently beneath the surface. It was time to hand them the bait. I finished the last bite of the apple pie and carefully set my fork down on the porcelain plate. The clink of the metal against the dish was the only sound in the room. Brian and Natalie were staring at me with the focused intensity of starving wolves watching a wounded animal take its final breath. They had played their parts perfectly all evening, and now they were waiting for their reward. I reached a trembling hand toward the thick leather folder resting on the chair beside me. I let my fingers slip off the leather once, pretending that my grip was weak and uncoordinated. Natalie actually leaned forward in her seat, her breath hitching slightly in her throat. She looked like she wanted to leap across the table and rip the folder out of my hands. I finally grasped the leather cover and pulled it onto my lap. I slowly unzipped the main compartment, letting the harsh metallic sound drag out for as long as possible. The sound seemed to echo in the quiet apartment, amplifying the thick tension in the air. I looked up at them, playing the role of the devoted father one last time. I told them I was just so glad I could do this for them. I said I wanted them to have a beautiful, spacious place to build their family, far away from the stress and noise of the city. I told them I just wanted to be helpful before I became too much of a burden. I reached inside the folder, and my fingers brushed against the thick, premium stock paper of the cashier check. Aaron had printed it exactly as I requested earlier that afternoon. It was not a personal check drawn from my private family savings account. It was a commercial draft issued directly from the primary operating reserves of Carter Holdings. I slowly pulled the document into the warm yellow light of the dining room chandelier. The paper was crisp and heavy, carrying the undeniable physical weight of nearly $1 million. I slid it across the smooth, polished wood of the dining table. I did not push it toward my son. I pushed it directly toward Natalie. She was the architect of my destruction, and I wanted to watch her take the bait with her own 2 hands. Natalie did not even wait for the check to stop moving before she snatched it up from the table. Both of her hands clamped down on the edges of the paper, holding it as if the wind might suddenly blow it away. I sat back in my chair and watched the transformation take over her face. It was a terrifying and fascinating thing to witness. I watched her eyes lock onto the numbers printed in bold black ink. $900,000. Her pupils dilated, instantly expanding until her eyes looked almost entirely black, reflecting the light from above. A flush of deep red crept up her neck and spread rapidly across her cheeks. It was the physical manifestation of pure, unadulterated greed flooding her nervous system. She let out a sharp gasp, a sound of absolute raw hunger finally being satisfied. Her hands actually began to shake, causing the heavy paper to rattle slightly in the quiet room. She was holding more money than she had ever seen in her entire life, and the sheer power of it was intoxicating her. She was so completely mesmerized by the number 9 and the 5 zeros following it that she did not look at anything else on the document. She did not look at the top left corner, where the bold corporate logo of my commercial engineering firm was clearly stamped in dark blue ink. She did not read the legal memo line printed at the very bottom, which explicitly designated the funds as a heavily restricted commercial real estate bridge loan subject to strict federal corporate tax regulations. She saw absolutely nothing but free money waiting to be spent. She traced her perfectly manicured fingernail over the printed amount, completely oblivious to the fact that she was currently holding a highly explosive financial device. My mind evaluated her reaction with the cold precision of an engineer inspecting a doomed structure. Her greed had created a massive blind spot. If she deposited that specific corporate draft into an unregistered limited liability company, as she had planned with her brother, she would instantly violate 3 different federal banking laws. The moment the bank routing numbers processed the transaction, an automated corporate fraud alert would trigger. The system would lock the funds entirely and automatically notify the Commercial Crimes Division of the attempted embezzlement. She was smiling at a loaded gun, completely convinced it was a winning lottery ticket. She did not ask a single question about the origin of the check. She did not ask why it looked different from a standard personal bank draft. Her vanity and her absolute confidence in her own intelligence had blinded her to the trap right in front of her face. Brian leaned over her shoulder to look at the piece of paper. He let out a long, heavy breath of relief and rubbed his hand forcefully over his face. He looked at me, his expression a mix of lingering guilt and overwhelming salvation. He told me I had no idea how much this meant to them and how it was going to change their lives forever. He was absolutely right about that, but not in the way he thought. It was going to change everything. It was going to strip away the illusion of their success and expose the rotting foundation beneath them. Natalie looked up from the check, her eyes shining with unshed tears of manufactured joy. She told me I was an absolute angel, and that she would never forget this incredible moment for as long as she lived. I looked right into her eyes, maintaining my soft, bewildered expression, and offered a slow, tired smile. I told her I knew she would not forget it. I told her this was a day that would stay with her for the rest of her life. I watched her carefully fold the corporate check exactly in half and slide it into the front pocket of her dress, right next to her heart. She patted the pocket once, a gesture of absolute ownership and triumph. The transaction was complete. The bait had been swallowed hook, line, and sinker. They had officially taken possession of the Trojan horse, and now all I had to do was wait for them to pull it inside their gates. The atmosphere in the dining room immediately shifted from tense anticipation to a sickeningly sweet celebration. Brian rushed to the kitchen to pour another round of the expensive wine, completely unaware that he was toasting to his own criminal implication. Natalie could not stop touching the pocket of her dress constantly, verifying that the paper was still there. She began talking rapidly about the new furniture she was going to buy for the suburban house, describing the exact shade of paint she wanted for the master bedroom. She talked about the sprawling backyard and the massive kitchen island, speaking as if I was just a ghost haunting the room. In her mind, I was already gone. I was already packed away in a sterile white room at the state facility, forgotten and silenced. I sat quietly and listened to her describe the empire she planned to build with my blood and sweat. I felt no anger. Anger is a hot, chaotic emotion that leads to mistakes. I only felt the cold, structural permanence of what I had just accomplished. I had spent my life building things meant to endure the harshest conditions. But tonight, I had engineered a masterpiece of destruction. The check in her pocket was not wealth. It was a digital tracking beacon that would lead federal investigators directly into the heart of her fraudulent enterprise. I finished my glass of water and slowly pushed my chair back from the table. I told them I was feeling very tired and needed to go home to rest. They practically jumped out of their seats to help me to the door, their previous irritation completely replaced by an overwhelming desire to get me out of the apartment so they could celebrate in peace. Natalie handed me my coat and gave me one final crushing hug. The trap was locked. The countdown had begun. The heavy door clicked shut behind me, and I walked out into the cool evening air. But the story of that night did not end when I left their apartment. From the digital footprints Aaron and I uncovered later during the investigation, I know exactly what happened the second my truck pulled away from the curb. The heavy veil of fake sympathy dropped instantly. Brian walked over to the deadbolt and locked the door, sealing themselves inside their own manufactured kingdom. Natalie did not even wait to clear the dinner plates or wash the wine glasses. She walked straight to the kitchen island, placed the heavy corporate check right in the center of the cold marble counter, and poured herself a massive glass of the expensive wine. They stood there basking in the glow of $900,000, entirely convinced they were the absolute masters of their own destiny. The celebration was not just a quiet moment of relief between a husband and wife. It was a vicious, arrogant victory lap. Natalie immediately picked up her phone and dialed her brother, the co-conspirator in their real estate theft. I can perfectly imagine the shrill, triumphant tone of her voice as she told him the old man had actually done it. She told him I was completely clueless, so mentally compromised and broken down that I just handed over my life savings without asking a single question. Her brother, sitting in his own home miles away, logged onto his computer to finalize the last steps of their trap. They spent the next hour laughing over the phone, openly mocking my slow walk, my trembling hands, and my confused questions at the dinner table. They mocked the very weakness I had weaponized against them, celebrating their cruelty as if it were a mark of high intelligence. While Natalie bragged on the phone, Brian sat down at his laptop to complete the online registration for the new property deed. This was the moment he officially crossed the line from a passive, cowardly son into an active participant in federal fraud. He typed his own father's name into the transfer documents, systematically removing my legal rights to the money I had earned with my own sweat and blood. Then, under Natalie's strict instructions, he routed the receiving bank account, not to his own personal name, but directly into the newly formed shell company controlled entirely by his wife's family. He paid the small state filing fee with his credit card and clicked the submit button legally, binding the massive transaction to the fraudulent entity. He thought he was locking in his wealthy future. He did not realize he was pulling the pin on a financial grenade. The physical check still sat on the kitchen counter, a ticking time bomb disguised as a golden ticket. In their drunken, euphoric state, neither of them bothered to look closely at the blue ink stamped across the top of the paper. They were so blinded by their own massive greed that the bold words Carter Holdings meant absolutely nothing to them. They did not understand the severe legal difference between a personal family gift and a restricted commercial bridge loan. They assumed that because I was old, I was stupid. They assumed that because I loved my son, I was completely blind to his true nature. That arrogance was the true architect of their downfall. They spent the rest of the evening planning their lavish move to the suburbs, discussing what kind of luxury European car Brian should buy with the leftover funds, and finalizing the exact date they would drive me to the state-run nursing facility. That night was the absolute last time Brian and Natalie would ever sleep peacefully in each other's arms. They went to bed believing they had conquered the world, dreaming of massive houses, designer wardrobes, and a life entirely funded by my sacrifice. They had absolutely no idea that the digital wheels of the federal banking system were already turning against them. They did not know that by submitting those specific limited liability company documents, they had just initiated an automated corporate audit that would tear their lives apart. The illusion of victory is an incredibly powerful drug, and they had consumed a lethal dose. I drove home that night under a clear, starless sky, feeling a profound sense of absolute calm. The foundation of their lies was fully poured, the structural supports were completely compromised, and all I had to do was wait for the morning sun to watch it all completely collapse. It was exactly 1 week before their scheduled closing date when the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the silent house. I was sitting in my leather armchair by the large bay window, reviewing a textbook on advanced structural load-bearing capacities. I looked out through the sheer white curtains and saw Brian standing on my front porch. He was entirely alone. He shifted his weight nervously from one foot to the other, constantly checking his expensive wristwatch and looking back toward his vehicle parked hurriedly on the street. He did not look like a confident man who was about to move into $1 million suburban estate. He looked exactly like a thief trying to steal a television in broad daylight and terrified of being caught. I placed my heavy book gently on the wooden coffee table and took a deep, steadying breath. I let my shoulders slump forward, allowing my spine to curve slightly, and resumed the physical posture of the frail old man they so desperately needed me to be. I walked slowly toward the foyer, dragging my left foot just a fraction of an inch against the hardwood floor to mimic a failing body. I pulled the heavy oak door open, and Brian immediately forced a wide, artificial smile onto his face. He was holding a thick manila envelope tightly against his chest, as if it were a shield. He asked if he could come inside for just a minute, claiming he was running a few errands in my neighborhood and simply wanted to check on my health. I stepped aside and motioned for him to enter my home. He walked quickly into the living room, refusing my offer to take his jacket or sit down on the comfortable sofa. The nervous, anxious energy rolling off his body was practically visible, filling the room with a suffocating tension. He was not here for a friendly afternoon visit. He was here to execute the final phase of their cruel plan to permanently erase me from society. He cleared his throat loudly and opened the manila envelope, pulling out a thick stack of dense legal papers printed on heavy premium stock. He told me he was incredibly sorry to bother me with boring administrative paperwork, but that his life insurance company suddenly required a standard medical release form signed by his immediate family members. He spoke rapidly, trying to overwhelm my senses with technical financial jargon and a manufactured sense of absolute urgency. He claimed it was a brand new policy requirement, necessary to secure the final mortgage approval for the beautiful suburban house, and that if I did not sign the document today, the bank might completely delay the closing process. He handed me a sleek black pen and pointed to a small yellow sticky note attached to the bottom corner of the third page. He told me I did not need to worry about reading all the confusing legal text, and that I simply needed to sign my name right on the dotted line to help him out. I took the heavy stack of papers from his visibly shaking hands. I did not immediately press the pen to the paper. I slowly brought the pages closer to my face, squinting my eyes heavily, as if my vision was failing me completely. I deliberately bypassed the bright yellow sticky note and read the bold black text printed at the very top of the first page. It was absolutely not a standard medical release form for a life insurance policy. It was a comprehensive declaration of medical incompetence and an irrevocable transfer of medical power of attorney. The document specifically granted Brian the absolute legal authority to involuntarily commit me to a long-term, state-run care facility without my consent. It explicitly stripped me of my fundamental right to challenge his medical decisions in a court of law, and handed him total control over my physical freedom. I stood there, in the center of my own living room, holding the physical blueprint of my permanent imprisonment. My only son was standing just 2 feet away from me, actively lying directly to my face and trying to trick me into signing away my basic human rights. A profound and chilling silence fell over my entire mind, drowning out the sound of the ticking clock on the wall. For the past week, I had focused entirely on Natalie, assuming she was the primary aggressive driving force behind this unimaginable evil. I had desperately tried to convince myself that Brian was simply a weak, cowardly man who had been thoroughly manipulated by a greedy and vicious wife. I wanted to believe that somewhere deep down, beneath the entitlement, he still possessed a tiny shred of loyalty to the father who had sacrificed everything to build a safe world for him. But staring at the cold, legal document, resting in my hands, that comforting illusion completely and violently shattered. Natalie was not standing in my living room today. Brian had driven his car to my house entirely alone. Brian had printed these specific legal papers from his own computer. Brian was the one looking me directly in my eyes and telling me a calculated, malicious lie designed to lock me in a sterile white room for the remainder of my natural life. The ultimate betrayal was not passive or accidental. It was entirely intentional and thoroughly premeditated. The innocent boy I had raised, and the young man whose endless mistakes I had continuously paid for, was completely dead and gone. He had been permanently replaced by a hollow, greedy shell of a human being who viewed my continued existence as nothing more than an annoying financial obstacle to be swiftly removed. I felt absolutely no urge to yell at him or express my breaking heart. I felt no desire to grab him by the shoulders and demand a tearful explanation for his cruelty. Decades of engineering experience had taught me that you cannot reason with the parasite destroying a foundation. You can only let it consume the poison you have carefully laid out for it and wait for the inevitable collapse. I looked up at Brian and offered him a soft, incredibly tired smile. I told him the tiny print was just so confusing for my old eyes, but that I trusted him completely with all my heart. I told him I would do absolutely anything to make sure he and Natalie finally got their beautiful new dream home. The wave of relief that immediately washed over his sweating face was absolutely nauseating to witness. He let out a long, heavy breath and nodded his head rapidly, urging me to just sign the paper quickly so he could get out of my hair and finish his errands. I pressed the metal tip of the black pen against the thick white paper, but I did not write my normal fluid signature. The morning after I overheard their vile conversation on the apartment patio, Aaron and I had quietly filed a highly specific and binding legal affidavit with the state registry. We established a formally recognized duress signature. It is a very subtle but legally ironclad variation of a person's normal handwriting designed specifically to alert banking authorities and federal judges that a legal document is being signed under severe threat, manipulation, or active fraud. Instead of my smooth, connected cursive letters, I signed my first and last name with sharp, jagged, disconnected block letters, making sure to intentionally and visibly misspell my own middle name. I added a small, very distinct loop at the very end of the final letter, exactly as Aaron had instructed me to do during our private meeting. To the untrained, eager eye of a greedy and impatient son, it looked exactly like the shaky, confused handwriting of a frail man suffering from severe cognitive decline. But to a trained federal fraud investigator or a presiding judge, it was an undeniable distress signal and a definitive, undeniable proof of felony elder abuse. I slowly handed the signed document back to Brian. He snatched it out of my trembling hand with terrifying speed, sliding it immediately back into the brown manila envelope. He was so blinded by his own victory that he did not even bother to look closely at the wet ink on the page. He patted me awkwardly on the shoulder, told me he loved me, and practically ran out of my front door without looking back. I stood by the window and watched his car speed away down the quiet residential street, completely unaware that he was carrying a loaded legal bomb in his passenger seat. He truly thought he had just successfully secured his wealthy, luxurious future and silenced my voice forever. In absolute reality, he had just personally handed me the final undeniable piece of evidence I needed to send him directly to federal prison. The medical form ambush was officially over, and the devastating trap was now fully armed and waiting to detonate at the closing table. The morning of the closing was cold and bright. The downtown offices of the premier title and escrow company occupied the entire 40th floor of a glass and steel high-rise. I stood quietly in the carpeted reception area, completely out of their line of sight, observing the conference room through the thick frosted glass wall. The room they had chosen for their absolute victory was designed to project wealth and permanence. At the center of the room sat a massive polished mahogany table, its deep red surface reflecting the warm light of the crystal chandelier hanging above it. At the far end of the room, a tall, antique grandfather clock stood against the wall, its heavy brass pendulum swinging back and forth with a slow, rhythmic ticking sound. Each heavy tick echoed in the quiet space, marking the final seconds of their manufactured empire. Natalie sat at the head of the mahogany table, treating the closing appointment as if it were her own personal coronation. She had dressed for the occasion with calculated extravagance, wearing a tailored white designer suit that practically screamed new money. Her hair was perfectly styled, and the stolen diamond tennis bracelet glittered aggressively under the chandelier lights every time she moved her wrist. She sat up completely straight, her shoulders pulled back, radiating an overwhelming aura of smug, absolute entitlement. She was not just buying a house today. She was actively conquering my family. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the polished wood, her eyes completely fixed on the thick stack of legal documents resting in front of the title agent. She was practically vibrating with barely contained excitement, a predator seconds away from consuming its final meal. She looked around the luxurious conference room, breathing in the scent of expensive leather and freshly brewed coffee, as if it were oxygen she had been denied her entire life. Brian sat directly to her right, looking like a man who had successfully convinced himself that his crimes were actually virtues. He was wearing the expensive Italian suit I had bought for him just last year, completely unaware of the sickening irony. The nervous, sweating coward who had stood in my living room a week ago trying to trick me into signing away my freedom was completely gone. In his place sat a man bathing in the warm, comfortable glow of stolen wealth. He had his legs crossed casually at the ankle, one arm draped over the back of the heavy leather chair. He smiled at the title agent, making charming small talk about the local weather and the excellent view of the city skyline from the 40th floor. He had completely detached his mind from the reality of what he had done. He did not spend a single second thinking about the father he planned to lock in a state-run medical ward. He was entirely focused on the sprawling suburban lawn and the massive kitchen island he was about to own without ever working a single day to earn it. His arrogance was profound because it was built entirely on the foundation of someone else's lifetime of hard labor. The title agent, an older woman with silver hair and a professional, practiced smile, began sorting the final paperwork into 3 distinct piles. The slow, deliberate shuffling of the thick, premium paper sounded incredibly loud in the quiet room, competing only with the relentless ticking of the grandfather clock. The agent placed a heavy silver pen down in the center of the table right between Brian and Natalie. She explained that they would need to sign the property transfer deed first, officially moving the title from the sellers directly into the newly formed Family Limited Liability Company. She pointed to a line at the bottom of the page explaining the legal binding nature of the signature. Natalie reached out and picked up the silver pen, her fingers wrapping tightly around the cool metal. She held it as if it were a royal scepter. She looked down at the signature line, her chest rising and falling with deep, triumphant breaths. She was about to successfully funnel $900,000 of my commercial engineering funds into a private shell company controlled entirely by her brother. She was about to complete the ultimate theft right out in the open under the guise of a standard residential real estate transaction. Brian leaned closer to his wife, whispering something in her ear that made her let out a sharp, victorious laugh. They were completely insulated inside their bubble of absolute arrogance. They believed they had outsmarted a dying old man. They believed they had navigated the complex legal system with flawless precision. They assumed the massive corporate check I had given them at dinner was quietly resting in the escrow accounts, completely cleared and ready to be distributed. They had absolutely no idea that the federal banking system had frozen that specific transaction 72 hours ago. They had no idea that a corporate fraud alert had already been fully processed, and that the money they were currently celebrating did not actually exist anywhere in the world. They were sitting at the highest peak of their delusion, entirely convinced that the world belonged to them. The grandfather clock ticked forward, the brass pendulum reflecting a flash of golden light across the mahogany table. The sound seemed to slow down, stretching the moment into an eternity. Natalie uncapped the silver pen and brought the tip down until it was hovering just a fraction of a millimeter above the crisp white paper. She paused for one final second, savoring the ultimate peak of her greedy ambition. She believed this was the exact moment her entire life changed for the better. She believed she had permanently secured her immense wealth and successfully eliminated the only human obstacle standing in her way. She was completely blind to the fact that the floor beneath her feet had already been entirely demolished by the very man she thought she had buried. She was standing on nothing but empty air, waiting for gravity to take over. I watched her from the shadows of the reception area, feeling the cold, calculated precision mass of the trap finalizing its absolute grip. I let her enjoy that final second of absolute supremacy. I let her feel the intoxicating rush of total victory. Then I stepped forward out of the shadows and walked directly toward the heavy glass door of the conference room. I pushed the heavy glass door open just as the silver pen began its descent toward the paper. I did not knock on the frame. I did not ask for permission to interrupt. The thick glass swung inward with a heavy swoosh of displaced air, completely shattering the quiet sanctity of their manufactured victory. I walked into the room and let the door swing shut behind me. The heavy metallic click of the latch locking into place echoed louder than the antique grandfather clock, entirely silencing the room. Aaron stepped in right behind me, his leather briefcase gripped firmly in his right hand, his face set in a mask of absolute professional stone. I did not drag my left foot against the carpet. I did not hunch my shoulders forward. I stood completely straight, my spine aligned with the rigid perfection of a steel support beam. I walked over to the edge of the massive mahogany table, projecting the undeniable physical authority of a man who owned the very ground they were sitting on. The shift in the room was not gradual. It was a sudden, violent plunge in atmospheric pressure. The warm, comfortable scent of expensive coffee seemed to instantly turn sour in the air. Brian reacted first. The charming, relaxed smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He jerked upright in his heavy leather chair, pulling his arm down from the backrest as if the leather had suddenly caught fire. The color completely drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He looked at me, and then he looked at the thick manila folder Aaron was carrying, realizing instantly that the frail, confused old man he had tricked in his living room was completely gone. Natalie froze entirely. Her hand stopped moving just a fraction of an inch above the signature line. The silver pen hovered in the air, her knuckles turning white from the sudden death grip she had on the metal barrel. She stared at me, her eyes wide and rapidly calculating, desperately trying to process how the victim she had already buried was currently standing in her pristine conference room. The title agent looked back and forth between us, her professional smile slipping into an expression of deep confusion and sudden caution. She slowly pulled her hands away from the documents, sensing the massive invisible weight of the impending conflict. Natalie was a predator, and predators do not surrender their prey easily. I watched her brain rapidly reboot, switching gears from absolute triumph to desperate damage control. She carefully placed the silver pen down on the polished wood, deliberately avoiding my eyes. She plastered a sickeningly sweet smile onto her face and stood up from her chair, smoothing the front of her expensive white designer suit. She walked toward me, speaking in that high-pitched, patronizing tone she always used when she wanted to manipulate me. She called me Dad and asked what on earth I was doing all the way downtown by myself. She reached out to touch my arm, acting as if I was a lost child who had wandered into a dangerous intersection. She told me this was a very boring private financial meeting and that I must have gotten completely confused about my schedule. She actually turned to the title agent and let out a soft, manufactured laugh, claiming that my memory was getting worse every single day and apologizing for the unexpected interruption. She told Brian to be a good son and escort me down to the lobby so I could wait for them to finish their paperwork. It was a breathtaking display of pure sociopathic arrogance. She was actively trying to gaslight me in front of my own lawyer, attempting to use my supposed medical incompetence to physically remove me from the room before I could ruin her massive theft. I did not let her touch me. As her manicured hand reached for my coat, I took a single deliberate step forward, completely invading her personal space and forcing her to step back. I looked down at her, dropping the tired, confused facade entirely. I looked at her with the cold, dead eyes of an engineer inspecting a failed load-bearing wall. I did not raise my voice. I spoke in a low, flat tone that carried across the quiet room like a physical shockwave. I told her I was not confused, and I was exactly where I needed to be. I told her to sit down and stop talking. The absolute authority in my voice hit her like a physical blow. The fake smile shattered instantly, falling away to reveal the naked, panicked greed underneath. She backed away from me, her chest heaving as she bumped into the edge of the mahogany table. Brian opened his mouth to speak, his voice trembling as he tried to ask Aaron why he was here. He never got the chance to finish his sentence. Aaron stepped up to the table, completely ignoring Brian. He placed his heavy leather briefcase directly on top of the blank property transfer deed, completely covering the signature line Natalie had been about to sign. The dull thud of the briefcase hitting the wood sounded like a judge dropping a gavel. The time for polite family deception was officially over. The uninvited guests had taken total control of the room, and the financial demolition was about to begin. Aaron did not look at my son or my daughter-in-law as he approached the edge of the massive table. He directed his attention entirely to the silver-haired title agent sitting at the far end of the room. He unlatched the heavy brass locks of his leather briefcase, and the sharp metallic click echoed like a gunshot in the tense silence. He pulled out a thick stack of documents bound by a heavy red legal seal. He lifted the stack and let it drop flat onto the polished mahogany wood, directly next to the blank property transfer deed Natalie had been about to sign. The heavy thud sounded like a vault door slamming shut forever. The title agent stared at the red seal, her professional instincts immediately recognizing the severe visual markers of a federal banking injunction. She pulled her hands back from the table entirely, refusing to touch any of the paperwork they had brought. She pushed her chair back, scraping the legs loudly against the floor, physically distancing herself from the transaction. Natalie stared at the heavy folder, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths. She demanded to know what was in the folder, her voice cracking under the sudden immense pressure. She insisted the money was already sitting safely in the escrow accounts, and accused us of trying to ruin her special day out of pure spite. Aaron finally turned to look directly at her, his expression completely devoid of any emotion or sympathy. He told her there was absolutely no money in the escrow accounts. He spoke with the slow, deliberate cadence of a teacher, explaining a very simple concept to a very stubborn child. He told her she did not deposit a personal family gift from a tired old man. He explained that the $900,000 draft I handed her at the dinner table was a highly restricted commercial bridge loan pulled directly from the operating reserves of Carter Holdings. He watched the absolute confusion wash over her face as she tried to comprehend the dense legal terminology. She had been so entirely blinded by her own massive greed that night that she never even bothered to read the blue corporate stamp printed clearly at the top of the paper. She just folded it and shoved it right next to her heart. Aaron explained that my commercial engineering firm operates under incredibly strict financial covenants regarding the distribution of its corporate assets. The money was explicitly and legally designated for a primary residential purchase under the name of my direct dependent only. It was absolutely not authorized under any circumstances to be funneled into a private third-party shell company. Brian shifted violently in his leather chair, his face turning a sickly shade of pale green. He looked at Natalie, his eyes wide with sudden terror, and asked her what Aaron was talking about. He asked her if she had put the money into their joint family account like they originally planned to do. Natalie completely ignored him, her eyes locked onto Aaron with a look of desperate feral panic. Aaron opened the red-sealed folder and spread the federal documents out across the table so they were entirely visible under the bright chandelier lights. He pointed his finger at a formal letter bearing the official gold seal of the Federal Banking Commission. He told them exactly what happened when Brian sat at his computer and submitted the digital transfer request 3 days ago. He explained that when the banking routing numbers attempted to force the commercial funds out of my corporate reserves and into the unregistered limited liability company controlled by her brother, it instantly triggered an automated corporate embezzlement algorithm. The federal banking system did not just flag the transaction for a routine review. It completely froze the entire $900,000 and immediately locked down every single receiving account associated with the transfer. Aaron leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the mahogany wood, and delivered the final crushing blow to her manufactured reality. He told her the Commercial Crimes Division had already opened a formal active investigation into the attempted theft of corporate assets. He explained that the federal government views the unauthorized redirection of commercial bridge loans as felony wire fraud and money laundering. She had not outsmarted a frail old man whose mind was slowly slipping away. She had just provided a flawless, undeniable paper trail of severe federal crimes directly to the authorities. She had done all the heavy lifting to build the cage she was about to be locked inside. The absolute silence that followed his words was suffocating and heavy. It was the distinct sound of a completely manufactured reality violently collapsing in on itself. Natalie shook her head frantically from side to side, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face and ruining the pristine image she had curated. She verbally refused to believe it. She reached into her expensive designer handbag with badly trembling hands and pulled out her cell phone. She tapped the glass screen violently, trying to open her banking application, to prove to the entire room that we were lying to her. I stood completely still and watched her eyes dart desperately across the glowing screen, searching for the $900,000 she truly believed belonged to her. Instead, she found a bright red banner displayed aggressively across the top of her account dashboard, indicating a complete administrative freeze on all of her personal funds. Her hands began to shake so violently that the phone slipped from her fingers and clattered loudly against the hard surface of the table. The breath left her lungs in a ragged, gasping sob that sounded like a dying animal. The overwhelming arrogance she had carried into the room just 10 minutes ago was entirely eradicated, leaving behind nothing but the naked terror of a criminal caught perfectly in the act. She looked at me, her eyes begging for a reprieve, silently asking me to tell Aaron it was just a terrible misunderstanding. I gave her absolutely nothing. I stood there like a wall of solid concrete, reflecting her own calculated cruelty right back at her. But the structural demolition was not yet finished. You do not leave a compromised support beam standing when you tear down a condemned building. You must completely clear the site to ensure the rot never returns. Aaron reached into his leather briefcase one final time and pulled out a single crisp sheet of paper printed on the official heavy letterhead of the State Real Estate Commission. He slid it slowly across the smooth wood until it rested directly in front of Natalie, covering her cell phone. He told her that because she was a licensed real estate broker, the authorities viewed her actions not just as private financial fraud, but as a severe and unforgivable violation of her professional fiduciary duties. He explained that utilizing her specialized industry knowledge to establish a fraudulent shell company and attempting to launder stolen corporate funds through a standard residential closing had triggered an immediate automatic suspension of her broker license. The piece of paper resting in front of her was the official legal notice of that suspension. She could no longer legally sell property or represent clients anywhere in the state pending the final outcome of the federal investigation. Her career, the very foundation of her fake wealthy persona, and her primary source of unearned pride was entirely destroyed in a matter of seconds. She would lose her job, her luxury company car, and her pristine reputation by the end of the business day. The flawless architect of my destruction was now sitting in the ruins of her own life with absolutely nowhere left to hide. The devastating reality of the suspended real estate license hung in the heavy air of the conference room for only a few agonizing seconds before Natalie completely snapped. The polished, sophisticated woman who had walked into the room acting like royalty was entirely gone. In her place was a cornered, desperate animal willing to tear down anyone in her path to survive. She slammed her hands down on the mahogany table so hard that the heavy silver pen rattled loudly against the wood. She turned her entire body toward Brian, her eyes wide and wild with a manic, terrifying energy. She grabbed him by the lapels of his expensive Italian suit and violently shook him. She screamed at him to do something, her voice echoing shrilly off the thick glass walls. She told him he was completely pathetic for just sitting there while we ruined their entire future. Then the desperate light bulb went off in her panicked mind. She remembered the legal weapon they thought they still possessed. She released his suit and pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. She screamed at Brian to use the power of attorney right now. She commanded him to take out the medical incompetence forms he had forced me to sign last week and slap them down on the table. In her absolute frantic desperation, she convinced herself that if Brian had total legal control over my physical and financial autonomy, he could somehow bypass the federal corporate lock. She yelled that Brian could legally sign the property transfer deed on my own behalf, force the title company to accept the transaction, and deal with the banking authorities later. She was completely unhinged, entirely ignoring the fact that federal wire fraud cannot be cured by a family court medical document. She just needed a lifeline, and she was demanding her husband throw it to her, regardless of the consequences. Brian was practically hyperventilating, completely overwhelmed by the speed at which his wealthy future was violently evaporating. But he was also completely terrified of the vicious woman screaming in his face. He reached into his leather messenger bag resting on the floor and frantically pulled out the brown manila envelope. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely untie the string closure. He pulled out the thick stack of medical declaration, forms the exact same papers he had brought to my living room a week ago. He slapped them onto the polished wood, pushing them aggressively toward the title agent. His voice cracked as he tried to assert a manufactured authority. He claimed he had absolute medical and financial power of attorney over me. He stated for the official record that I was suffering from severe cognitive decline, and that he was legally authorizing the real estate transaction to proceed immediately. He picked up the silver pen, fully intending to sign the property transfer deed himself to save his crumbling empire. The title agent literally rolled her chair backward, refusing to look at the papers. Aaron did not even blink. He reached out with one hand and casually slid the silver pen completely out of Brian's reach. He did not raise his voice. He simply opened his heavy leather briefcase for the third and final time. He pulled out a single stark white document stamped with the heavy black seal of the County Superior Court. He placed it directly on top of Brian's fraudulent medical papers. He told Brian to look very closely at the signature on the last page of the medical form. Brian stared at the paper, entirely confused by the instruction. Aaron explained that when Brian visited my home last week to trick his own father into signing away his freedom, he was entirely too eager to look at the wet ink. Aaron pointed a steady finger to the sharp, jagged block letters and my intentionally misspelled middle name. He calmly explained the legal concept of a documented duress signature. Brian looked up from the paper, the absolute horror finally dawning in his eyes as Aaron laid out the mechanics of the trap. Aaron explained that the moment Brian walked out of my house, I had immediately contacted him. We took that specific signature variation directly to a superior court judge. Aaron stated that attempting to utilize a document signed under documented legal duress is not just a messy family civil dispute. He explained that because I was a senior citizen, the moment Brian presented those papers to a bank or a title company, it automatically triggered a mandatory federal flag for severe felony elder abuse. The document Brian had just proudly slapped onto the table to save his wife was the exact piece of physical evidence required to issue an active arrest warrant. Aaron tapped his finger on the Superior Court injunction resting on the table. He told Brian that the injunction legally nullified any and all power of attorney claims immediately. He explained that the court had already been fully briefed on Brian's previous attempt to wire $300,000 using an outdated surgical document from 3 years ago. Aaron looked directly into Brian's terrified eyes and delivered the absolute final checkmate. He told my son that he was no longer making decisions for my estate. He told him that by presenting the fraudulent medical forms today, he had officially escalated his crime from attempted theft to active documented elder abuse in front of multiple professional witnesses. Natalie stopped screaming. The entire room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Brian stared at the court injunction, his mouth opening and closing without a single sound coming out. He had thought the medical forms were his absolute trump card, providing him with the ultimate control over my life and my assets. He finally realized they were his own personal death warrant. He had walked into the room believing he was the master of his own destiny, but he was nothing more than a puppet pulling on his own strings. The power of attorney counterstrike had landed with devastating, permanent precision. The legal walls had completely closed in, and there were no more doors left to open. The silver-haired title agent had been sitting completely motionless at the far end of the mahogany table. She had witnessed hundreds of messy real estate disputes during her long career, but she had never been an active witness to a coordinated federal felony. She looked at the fraudulent medical documents Brian had just thrown onto her table, and then she looked at the court injunction Aaron had placed right beside them. The professional courtesy completely vanished from her face. She realized instantly that her own title agency was actively being used as a staging ground for money laundering and elder abuse. If she allowed this transaction to proceed even a single inch further, she would be legally considered an accessory to the crimes. She did not say a word to Brian or Natalie. She simply reached out with both hands and pulled the entire stack of closing documents across the polished wood until they were safely resting against her chest. She picked up the blank property transfer deed, the fraudulent limited liability company registration, and the medical power of attorney forms. She opened a heavy metal lockbox sitting on the floor beside her chair and placed every single piece of paper inside it. The loud metallic snap of the lockbox closing was the final definitive sound of their future being sealed away. She looked directly at Brian and informed him that she was legally obligated under federal escrow regulations to report everything that had just happened in her conference room. She told him she was calling the authorities immediately and turning the lockbox directly over to the commercial fraud investigators. Brian collapsed back into his heavy leather chair. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking violently as the absolute reality of his impending arrest finally crushed the last remaining breath out of his lungs. But Natalie was still frantically searching for a way out. She looked at Aaron, her voice reduced to a pathetic whimpering whisper. She begged him to just cancel the corporate check and let them walk away. She promised they would never bother me again and that they would just go back to their apartment and forget any of this ever happened. Aaron shook his head slowly. He told her she was fundamentally misunderstanding the scope of the destruction she had caused. He reminded her that the limited liability company she had tried to use to steal the house was not registered in her name. It was registered entirely under her older brother. Aaron explained that when she instructed her brother to set up that specific shell company to receive stolen corporate bridge loans, she had officially made him the primary beneficiary of a federal wire fraud conspiracy. When the banking authorities trace the digital routing numbers from the frozen $900,000, they will not just be coming to her apartment. They will be raiding her brother's home and seizing all of his personal assets to cover the corporate investigation penalties. The final ounce of fight completely drained out of Natalie. Her knees buckled and she slumped heavily against the edge of the mahogany table, dragging her expensive white designer suit against the wood. She had not just ruined her own life and her husband's life. In her blinding, arrogant greed, she had completely destroyed her own family. Her brother was going to federal prison because he had trusted her arrogant promises of easy wealth. She covered her mouth with her trembling hands, a low, agonizing moan escaping her throat. It was the sound of a parasite realizing it had just consumed the very poison that would kill it. I stood there and watched the two of them entirely broken and defeated. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I had spent my entire life protecting Brian from the consequences of his own terrible decisions. I had constantly reinforced a failing structure, hoping that my love and my money could somehow hold it together. But a structure built on entitlement and deceit will always eventually collapse. Today, I had simply stopped holding up the walls and allowed gravity to finally take its natural course. The checkmate was absolute and permanent. I turned my back on my son and his wife. I did not offer them a goodbye. I walked out of the glass conference room with Aaron right beside me, leaving them sitting in the suffocating silence of their own manufactured tomb. The title agent was already picking up the phone to call the police as we walked into the elevator lobby. The heavy steel doors of the elevator slid shut, entirely cutting off the sight of the mahogany table and the antique grandfather clock. The elaborate trap I had designed was completely empty now. It had successfully caught exactly what it was built to catch, and my hands were finally clean. The heavy glass doors of the conference room remained closed, but the absolute isolation inside was completely suffocating. The silver-haired title agent kept her word. She picked up the sleek black telephone on her desk and dialed the direct line for building security and the local authorities. Brian and Natalie were completely paralyzed. They sat at the massive mahogany table like stone statues, unable to comprehend the massive speed at which their lives had just been violently dismantled. The beautiful suburban house with the sprawling lawn and the massive kitchen island ceased to exist. It was replaced entirely by the cold, hard reality of federal fraud charges and imminent arrest. Natalie was still slumped against the polished wood, her expensive white designer suit wrinkled and stained with the sweat of her own sheer terror. She looked at the heavy metal lockbox sitting securely by the title agent, knowing that every single piece of evidence required to send her to federal prison was locked safely inside. Brian finally found his voice, but it was nothing more than a pathetic, broken whisper. He asked his wife what they were going to do. He looked at her, expecting the confident, arrogant woman who always had a manipulative plan for every situation. But that woman was completely gone. She did not have a plan. She did not have a witty response or a clever legal loophole. She just stared blankly at the empty space on the table where the property transfer deed used to be. Less than 10 minutes later, the heavy glass door swung open again. It was not me returning to save them. It was two uniformed building security guards accompanied by 3 local police officers who had been patrolling the downtown financial district. The title agent stood up calmly and handed the metal lockbox directly to the lead officer. She pointed her finger squarely at Brian and Natalie, formally identifying them as the individuals attempting to execute a fraudulent commercial wire transfer and commit felony elder abuse in her office. The officers did not draw their weapons, but their physical presence was an overwhelming wall of absolute authority. They instructed Brian and Natalie to stand up and step away from the table. Natalie tried to protest. She tried to use her polished real estate broker voice, attempting to explain that this was simply a massive misunderstanding between a confused father and his loving children. The lead officer looked down at the official State Real Estate Commission suspension notice still resting on the table. He told her she was no longer a licensed broker and that she needed to remain completely silent. The ultimate humiliation began as the officers escorted them out of the conference room. They were forced to walk through the crowded 40th floor reception area. Dozens of other real estate professionals, mortgage brokers, and wealthy clients stopped what they were doing to watch the spectacle. Natalie had spent her entire career desperately trying to impress these exact people. She had built her entire identity around projecting an image of flawless wealth and untouchable success. Now those same people were watching her being marched out of a premier title agency by uniformed police officers. Her professional reputation was not just damaged, it was publicly and permanently executed right in front of her peers. She lowered her head, trying to hide her face behind her messy hair, completely ruined and entirely exposed. The officers escorted them down the elevator and out into the cold, bright morning air of the city street. Because the Federal Banking Commission needed time to formally process the complex wire fraud charges, the local police did not place them in handcuffs immediately. They were officially detained, questioned, and ordered not to leave the city limits while the federal warrants were being fully prepared. As soon as the officers stepped back to secure the physical evidence, Brian and Natalie violently turned on each other. The toxic foundation of their marriage, built entirely on stolen money and shared arrogance, instantly fractured. Brian pointed a shaking finger at his wife, his voice echoing loudly across the busy sidewalk. He screamed that this was all her fault. He yelled that he never wanted to steal the commercial funds, and that she was the one who forced him to use the fake limited liability company. He blamed her entirely for the fraudulent medical documents, completely ignoring his own willing participation. He called her a greedy parasite who had completely destroyed his relationship with his father. Natalie did not take the insult quietly. The cornered animal inside her lashed out with vicious precision. She screamed right back at him, her face completely red with manic rage. She called him a pathetic, weak coward who could not even provide a decent life for his own wife without begging his daddy for money. She yelled that he was entirely, completely useless, and that if he had just been a real man, they would never have needed to steal the money in the first place. They stood on the public sidewalk, tearing each other apart, using every deep insecurity and personal failure as a weapon. There was no love between them. There was no loyalty. When the promise of the $900,000 vanished, it took every single illusion of their happy marriage with it, leaving nothing but bitter, poisonous resentment. People walking past them on the street stopped to stare at the wealthy-looking couple screaming at each other like rabid dogs. Natalie finally turned her back on her husband. She hailed a passing taxi, her hands shaking so badly she could barely open the yellow door. She climbed inside and slammed the door shut, leaving Brian standing completely alone on the concrete pavement. He watched the taxi speed away, disappearing into the dense city traffic. He was entirely isolated. His wife despised him. His father had completely disowned him. He had absolutely no money, no new house, and a massive federal prison sentence rapidly approaching his doorstep. The expensive Italian suit he was wearing suddenly felt like a heavy, suffocating straitjacket. He looked up at the towering glass high-rise where he had just lost his entire future. The profound, absolute weight of his own actions finally crushed his chest. He realized with terrifying clarity that the only person in the entire world who had ever truly protected him was the father he had just tried to lock away in a medical facility. The cold realization set in that he had no lawyer, no financial resources, and absolutely no way out of the federal trap. Panic entirely consumed his mind. He pulled out his cell phone and stared at the dark screen. He knew he had absolutely no right to ask for mercy, but the sheer terror of federal prison drove him to do the only thing he knew how to do when he was in trouble. He began to run down the busy sidewalk, desperately searching for my truck, hoping he could somehow beg his way out of the massive destruction he had caused. The heavy brass doors of the elevator bank were polished to a mirror finish reflecting the cold marble of the hallway. Aaron stood silently beside me, pressing the down button to summon the car. We had only been waiting for a few seconds when the heavy wooden door leading to the main emergency stairwell burst open with a violent crash. It slammed violently against the wall, echoing like a gunshot down the long, empty corridor. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded against the patterned carpet. I did not turn around immediately. I recognized the uneven, desperate rhythm of that run. It was the exact same way Brian used to run when he broke a neighbor's window as a young child and came sprinting home hoping I would fix the problem before the consequences caught up to him. But there were no broken windows today. There was only a completely broken life. He practically collapsed against my back, grabbing the thick wool fabric of my coat with both of his violently shaking hands. He was gasping for air, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon. The expensive Italian suit was completely disheveled, the silk tie pulled loose and hanging haphazardly around his neck. He spun me around, falling heavily to his knees on the carpeted floor. He looked up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes, tears streaming rapidly down his face. He called me Dad, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine that echoed off the marble walls. He begged me to help him. He pleaded with me to call the federal banking investigators and tell them it was all just a giant family misunderstanding. He swore to me that he had absolutely no idea what Natalie was really planning. He lied right to my face, claiming she had completely controlled him and mentally manipulated him into signing the property transfer documents. He cried that he was just a victim of a greedy, manipulative woman, and that he never truly wanted to put me in a state medical facility. He reached out and grabbed my hands, squeezing them tightly, begging me to use my wealth to hire him a powerful defense lawyer. He said I was his father, and that fathers are supposed to protect their sons no matter what happens. I stood perfectly still and let him hold my hands. I did not pull away, but I also did not return the pressure. I looked down at the top of his head, watching him weep on the floor of a public office building. A month ago, seeing my son in this much agonizing pain would have torn my heart completely out of my chest. I would have moved heaven and earth, draining every single dollar I possessed to shield him from suffering. I would have fought the entire world to keep him safe. But standing there in that cold hallway, looking at the man who had actively plotted to erase my freedom and steal my legacy, I realized something profound and absolute. I felt absolutely nothing. The deep, endless well of paternal love that had driven my entire existence for over 3 decades was completely dry. There was no anger left in my blood. There was no lingering sadness. There was only the cold, sterile observation of an engineer watching a condemned building finally collapse into a pile of useless rubble. I looked at his tears, and I knew with absolute certainty they were not tears of genuine remorse. He was not crying because he had betrayed the father who loved him. He was crying because he had been caught. He was weeping for the sudden catastrophic loss of the massive suburban house, the luxury vehicles, and the unearned, wealthy lifestyle he thought he had successfully stolen. He was mourning the sudden, violent death of his own massive greed. He continued to babble wildly, making grand, impossible promises between his heavy sobs. He promised he would divorce Natalie immediately and never speak to her again. He promised he would move back into my house and take care of me every single day for the rest of my natural life. He promised he would get a normal job and pay back every single dollar he had ever taken from me, even if it took him 50 years. Every frantic word tumbling out of his mouth was a desperate, impossible negotiation. He was throwing anything he could think of against the wall, hoping something would stick and save him from federal prison. I listened to the pathetic sound of his voice, recognizing the absolute cowardice buried underneath the panic. He was entirely willing to throw his own wife to the wolves without a single second of hesitation, just to save his own skin. He had absolutely no loyalty to anyone or anything but his own personal comfort. He was exactly the selfish monster I had slowly created by constantly shielding him from the harsh reality of the world. I slowly pulled my hands out of his desperate grip. The sudden loss of physical contact made him stumble forward slightly. I took one deliberate step back, putting a cold physical distance between us. I looked directly into his panicked, wet eyes, and I finally spoke. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any warmth, anger, or paternal affection. I told him to stop lying to me and to stop lying to himself. I told him he was not a victim, and he was never going to be a victim. I reminded him that Natalie did not drive to my house alone last week. I stated clearly that he was the one who stood in my living room holding the brown manila envelope. He was the exact person who looked me directly in the eyes and lied to my face, telling me the medical incompetence declaration was just a standard life insurance form. I reminded him that he was the one who sat at his own computer in his apartment and willingly typed the digital routing numbers to funnel my corporate money into an unregistered shell company. I told him he made a calculated, conscious adult decision to completely destroy my life so he could live in a luxury house he did not earn. I watched the very last shred of hope completely die in his eyes. I told him that actions have permanent, absolute consequences, and that the financial safety net he had relied on his entire life was completely gone. I told him I would not spend a single penny of my hard-earned money to defend a man who actively plotted elder abuse against his own flesh and blood. I said the federal authorities were going to seize every digital device in his apartment, and that the undeniable paper trail he had foolishly created was going to seal his fate entirely. He opened his mouth to speak, but he had absolutely no words left. The childish excuses had completely run out. The soft electronic chime of the elevator arriving echoed through the quiet hallway. The heavy brass doors slid open, revealing the empty mirrored car. Aaron stepped inside, holding his leather briefcase, turning to face the hallway and waiting patiently for me. I looked at Brian one last time. He was still kneeling on the patterned carpet, his hands resting limply at his sides, a completely broken, empty shell of a man. I did not feel the need to offer a final emotional farewell. I did not wish him luck in his impending trials. I simply turned my back on him and stepped into the elevator. I pressed the glowing button for the ground floor. As the heavy brass doors began to slide shut, I saw him lower his head all the way to the floor, completely surrendering to the overwhelming reality of the massive destruction he had engineered. The doors locked together with a heavy metallic click, entirely cutting him out of my life forever. The absolute silence inside the elevator car was the most peaceful sound I had heard in years. Before I completely turned my back to walk into the waiting elevator, I stopped. There was one final structural defect that needed to be permanently addressed before the site could be completely abandoned. I held my hand out toward Aaron without looking away from my son. Aaron knew exactly what I needed. He reached into his leather briefcase one last time and pulled out a slim black presentation folder. It was far less intimidating than the heavy red sealed federal injunctions, but the paper inside carried a completely different and of devastating weight. I took the black folder from Aaron and looked down at Brian. He was still kneeling on the hallway carpet, his chest heaving with desperate, pathetic sobs. When he saw me pause and take the folder, a sudden sickening flash of hope ignited in his bloodshot eyes. He actually believed I was pulling out a lifeline. He thought I was handing him a legal defense contract or a check to hire a criminal attorney. He reached both of his trembling hands upward, cupping them together like a starving beggar waiting for a scrap of bread. I did not hand him a lifeline. I opened the black folder and pulled out the thick stack of printed financial ledgers we had compiled during the stealth audit. It was the complete itemized transaction history of the secondary joint account I had created specifically to protect him from catastrophic emergencies. I held the pages by the corner and let them unroll toward the floor. The list of unauthorized charges was incredibly long, entirely covered in bright red highlighted lines. Brian stared at the cascading sheets of paper, his wet eyes scanning the dense rows of numbers and merchant names. His brain was completely overloaded by the sudden destruction of his life, and he could not immediately process what he was looking at. He asked me what this was, his voice cracking into a high, thin whisper. I kept my voice completely devoid of any paternal warmth or sympathy. I explained the exact nature of the document resting in his hands. I told him he was looking at a complete digital autopsy of his own marriage. I explained that while he was busy sitting in his apartment, plotting to lock me in a state-run medical facility, his brilliant, sophisticated wife was already actively draining my emergency medical reserves. I watched his eyes widen in absolute horror as I began to list the specific highlighted charges. I read out the monthly payments for the luxury European vehicle she drove. I pointed out the massive charges for boutique designer clothing downtown and the thousands of dollars spent on weekend spa retreats. I made sure to specifically mention the $4,000 diamond tennis bracelet currently sitting on her wrist. I told him she had treated my life savings like a personal slush fund, swiping the debit card with absolute impunity while he was entirely too blind or too lazy to notice. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The sudden flash of hope that had illuminated his face just moments ago was instantly extinguished, replaced by a profound, sickening despair. He realized that Natalie had not just ruined his future by triggering a federal wire fraud investigation. She had actively bankrupted his past. She had stolen $62,000 from the only safety net he possessed to build a counterfeit image of wealth. I watched his hands begin to shake violently as the absolute total weight of his situation finally crushed him. He was a man with absolutely no career prospects, no house, and a massive impending federal legal battle. But the destruction was even deeper than that. Because he was legally married to Natalie, the debts she had accumulated and the money she had stolen were now legally his burden to bear. The federal courts would not just be coming after the $900,000 corporate loan. They would be seizing whatever pathetic assets he had left to compensate the estate for the $62,000 she had embezzled. He stared at the red numbers on the paper, his mouth opening and closing in silent, agonizing shock. He had completely sold his soul and betrayed his own father for a woman who was actively bleeding him dry behind his back. The absolute foolishness of his own existence was finally staring him right in the face. I did not feel the need to scream at him or demand an apology. An apology from a man like Brian is completely worthless because it is only born out of fear and never out of genuine remorse. I simply let the thick stack of papers slip completely from my fingers. The pages fluttered down, landing directly on his lap and spilling across the patterned carpet around his knees. He was completely surrounded by the undeniable physical proof of his own massive failure. I looked down at him one last time, feeling nothing but the cold, clean, empty space where a sun used to be. The ledger was entirely balanced. The structural failure had been completely contained, and the site was officially cleared. I delivered my final piece of advice to the broken man kneeling on the floor. I told him to start by paying off his wife's debts. I turned around and stepped into the elevator with Aaron. The brass doors slid shut with a heavy metallic click, cutting him out of my life forever. 6 months have passed since the heavy brass doors of that downtown elevator closed. I am no longer living in the loud, crowded city where I spent 4 decades pouring concrete and building commercial towers. I sold my large, empty house within a month of that final meeting. I packed up the few belongings that actually mattered to me and drove 300 miles north into the deep quiet of the mountains. I bought a modest but incredibly sturdy cabin, built from thick timber and heavy natural stone. It sits at the end of a long, winding dirt road, completely surrounded by towering pine trees and overlooking a massive, crystal-clear lake. The air up here is thin and cold, but it fills my lungs with a profound, absolute purity that I have not felt since I was a very young man. I am sitting on my wide wooden porch right now, drinking a cup of black coffee and watching the morning fog slowly roll off the surface of the water. The only sound is the wind moving through the heavy branches and the occasional call of a wild bird. There are no sirens here. There are no loud neighbors. And most importantly, there are no ungrateful children waiting to tear down the walls I spent my entire life building. I do not know exactly what happened to Brian and Natalie after that day at the title agency. I do not know if they are currently sitting in a federal prison cell or if they are living in a tiny, cheap apartment working minimum wage jobs to pay off massive legal debts. I simply do not care. The very first thing I did when I left the city was change my phone number and delete every single email account I owned. I hired Aaron to act as a permanent, impenetrable legal shield between me and the wreckage of my former family. I left strict, permanent instructions that absolutely no communication from my son or my former daughter-in-law is ever to be forwarded to me under any circumstances. I completely cut the infected branch away from the tree to save the roots. People often say that family is everything, and that blood is thicker than water. But decades of structural engineering have taught me that if water gets inside a foundation, it will freeze, expand, and completely shatter the strongest concrete in the world. Blood does not automatically guarantee loyalty, and sharing a last name does not give someone the right to destroy your life. I walked away from my only son, and I did it without a single ounce of regret, because the man I walked away from was not my son at all. He was just a parasite who had finally been permanently removed from the host. I have not stopped working, but my work looks very different now. I am no longer building massive commercial skyscrapers for wealthy corporations, and I am certainly no longer building financial safety nets for greedy entitled relatives. I have a large wooden drafting table set up in the corner of my living room, directly facing the large window overlooking the lake. Right now, the table is covered in thick blue rolls of architectural paper. I am currently volunteering my engineering expertise to design a brand new community center and emergency housing shelter for a struggling town located just a few miles down the mountain. The local charity had the land, but they could not afford the expensive structural blueprints required to get the municipal permits approved. I stepped in and took over the entire project. I am spending my days calculating load-bearing capacities, reviewing material costs, and designing a beautiful, safe space for families who have actually hit rock bottom through no fault of their own. I am using the wealth I protected to fund the concrete foundation and the steel framing. I am finally building a structure for people who will appreciate the roof over their heads instead of plotting to steal the deed. There is a deep, profound satisfaction in knowing that the final project of my life will stand strong long after I am gone, providing warmth and safety to strangers who truly need it. I do not feel lonely up here in the quiet mountains. Loneliness is what you feel when you are surrounded by people who are actively pretending to love you while secretly digging your grave. What I feel now is absolute, permanent peace. I wake up every single morning with a completely clear conscience, knowing my assets are secure, my dignity is completely intact, and my legacy will not be squandered on luxury cars and fake diamond bracelets. I spent my entire adult life trying to be a good father to a boy who only wanted a bank account. Now I am just being a good man. The storm is entirely over. The old rotting structure has been completely demolished, and the ground has been swept clean. I am Douglas Carter, and I have finally built a life that no one will ever be able to tear down. If there is one profound lesson I have taken from the ashes of my former family, it is that unconditional love should never mean unconditional surrender. We spend our lives pouring endless resources into our children, hoping to build a strong foundation for their future. But when you constantly shield someone from the weight of their own choices, you do not build a resilient adult. You build a parasite. True love requires firm boundaries, and genuine respect cannot ever be bought with a cashier check. Sometimes the most loving thing a father can do is finally step back and let the entire corrupt structure completely collapse. If you have ever had to make the difficult choice to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace, please share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more life lessons.